Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and another installment of our Peninsular War saga. We are looking at the Battle of Porto slash Oporto, depending on who you are and whether or not you favour the Portuguese pronunciation of the city or the more generalised and traditional description of the battle. I am joined, as you would expect, for this Peninsular War extravaganza by Josh Provum, master of adventures in Historyland, author of Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira and Every Hazard and Fatigue, who has just confided in me that he has about 37 other book projects, either in his mind or in development or being sort of vaguely oozed out of his brain, that we can look forward to in the near future. Lando, great to see you again. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm finally moving forward with some of the projects that you were just entertainingly telling the people about. Some of which you will see. I think some of the ones I'm working on now you'll be seeing over the next year and a half, I think.
So many, many more interviews to be lined up in the future, in addition to our Peninsular War series.
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. But you need to write a book on the Peninsular War, quite frankly. That is something that I'll continue to bash you over the head over until you admit defeat.
Well, I mean, the best idea I have at the second is not the Peninsular War, but I do
Tut tut.
have an idea about the Peninsular War, which would cover the basically the death of the old Spanish army, the 1808, 1809 campaigns.
Only you would take the mainstream topic of the Peninsular War and find a beautifully niche yet highly interesting angle to exploit. We shall have conversations, but I sympathize. I also have about 300,000 books that need writing, but including Peninsular War books. But trying to make it so is difficult. But to business, Oporto. Well, we're not going to actually start with Oporto. We're going to tail off what we did last time and just talk about the aftermath, the ripple effects of Corunna. For folks, we obviously did a Corunna episode. That was our last installment of the saga. Go back through the back catalogue if you are out of sync and if you've missed that. But fundamentally, Corunna is a disaster, and much less of a disaster for the French, but it's not a great ordeal for the French by any stretch of the imagination. It would be foolish to imply that the French do not suffer from the same privations and the same weather conditions that the British suffer from. But they do kick the British out. The British are sent reeling into the sea fundamentally. Sure, it's an evacuation, but it's something in the scale of Dunkirk. It's there's a nice kind of point of comparison there in terms of if they don't manage to hold the line, they don't get out. So things aren't looking great in terms of the situation in the Iberian Peninsula. Obviously, Napoleon at this point decides to head back home. He doesn't stay to finish the job in Spain because of pressures elsewhere in the empire. But he does have ideas, does he not? Having seen this, I've been looking at what he thinks is going to happen next, and it's quite amusing what his vision for the future is. Orders to Soult are, just head south, mate. You're up in Corunna in these, what they're the Galician mountains. Just go for a quick walk south. That seems perfectly reasonable. So you can probably be in Oporto by 1st Feb, maybe Lisbon by 10th Feb. That's easy. Sure, if you're just going for a hike, maybe. But like in the depths of winter, it's February, man. Like, have you not looked at a map?
Napoleon suddenly takes a very weird sort of high overview of the peninsula and of warfare in general from a guy who up till this point has shown extreme levels of preparation and planning and the understanding of reconnaissance and things like that. The Napoleon of the First Italian campaign is not giving these orders and expecting a general to carry them out, unless he is now so far down the rabbit hole of glory and destiny that he now believes that if he's giving orders on the assumption that if I was there, well, I could do it. which I think is actually probably somewhere at the heart of some of these orders. But yeah, not only did the French have to march through the Galician mountains to chase Moore into the sea, they're now being Soult's exhausted army is now being asked to march south through yet more mountains into Portugal because Portugal is rimmed with mountains. There are mountains everywhere across its frontiers. Um, and while he will do this, and we talked about this a little bit in the episode on Medellin, he's going to leave Ney in the juicy position of just sitting up there chasing General Romana around fruitlessly. And Soult is going to drag his frostbitten, hungry, starving, black transport deprived troops through no ships for them. Because let's face it, if the French had ships, Moore was not going to get out of there at all. I mean, sea power. If there was ever a moment where the Royal Navy could actually clap their hands together and said, "We saved we won the war," it would be the fact that they are there. That there's like you could always run for the sea and we'll show up eventually.
Yeah, it's one of those sort of you can run but you can't hide mentalities, isn't it? And there's a long tradition born out even from something like the Trafalgar campaign, right? Villeneuve runs to the Caribbean and Nelson follows, and then he runs back home thinking, well, he's never going to expect this. And Nelson, the intercepts, the sloops, the communication network, the spider web comes together. And sure, Nelson's weeks behind, but he is nonetheless chasing down and closing that gap, which I think does have a psychological tinge. And yeah, you're dead right. Like the French cannot travel by sea. The British are dominant on the oceans. Not to imply that French naval power does not exist. Of course it does.
Yeah.
The British are dominant, and that's why the Peninsular War is able to unfold in the way that it does. Without naval superiority, those incredibly fragile supply lines end up being hugely dangerous and kind of targets for French interception. So it's always important to bear that in mind. Without the Navy, the Peninsular War isn't possible in the way that it transpires, as we're actually going to see vis-a-vis Talavera in our next episode. But to return to return to the present, but the past, if that's not oxymoron.
You should go back to the future.
Indeed. In terms of the situation in northern Portugal, so Soult's army at this point, he's got a corps with him. You've got Generals de Division. That was an attempt at a French accent. My apologies.
You've
got Merle, you've got Mermet, Bière, and Delaborde. And folks will recognize Delaborde, of course, from our Release in Ramiro episode, and some of the units that appear in this are units that we've recognized from that peninsular, that early phase, that Wellesley phase, if you will, of the conflict. So you've got Swiss regiments in there, 3rd, 4th, 5th Swiss, Mermet's division, also has 31st Light, 47th Lean, 122nd Lean, Merle's division, 22nd Light, 4th Light, 15th Lean, 3 battalions of the 36th Lean. You've also got 66th Lean, 15th Light, 32nd Light, 82nd Lean, the Legion de Midi, 17th Light, 17th Lean, 86th Lean. So, folks might sort of recognize some of these from the Release of Ramiro episodes. And I think that's an interesting thing to just kind of hold on to in terms of psychology and just kind of reflect on the fact that some of these guys have had a hammering 3 times at the hands of the British. And sure, like for all that I've said that, Corunna is no great success, it is nonetheless a case of the British hold the line. And so, these guys have experienced it on both ends. They've been on the defensive and the offensive, and they've taken it in kind of both manners. So there's an interesting point there. I also want to just double back to what you were saying about Napoleon for a second. And I think there is something interesting in there about Napoleon, his own hype, and to what extent at this point is he just thinking, I can say and it will be so. But I also wonder if there are a couple of things at play here. Firstly, he's kind of done it. he has swept south in record time and swept all before him. And what does he think is standing against him? Some Portuguese guys? Like, he's not concerned about the Portuguese, realistically. Think about what Juno achieves
Mm.
in that dash for Lisbon that we talked about right at the start of this series. Um, he's probably not thinking that the Portuguese force is going to put up much of a fight. But also, it does make me wonder about the maps that the French have at this point in time, not least because this is going to become an issue in 1810 vis-a-vis the lines of Torres Vedras. And so is this an indication that actually the French really don't have good intelligence on what the geography of the Iberian Peninsula fundamentally looks like?
Yeah, I don't think that they do have any kind of great idea. Portugal Portugal's not well known to the French. It's slightly better known to the British. The British have a British army at the very least has a slight as a something of an operational history in Portugal from the 7 Years' War. They haven't been there for a very long time, but they will have some sort of cartographic understanding of how it works. And as we would like, this is not a Navy episode, but the Lisbon is there, so they are aware of it as a trading nation. So. Whereas the French, the whole deal with the relationship between France and the Iberian Peninsula from the accession of the Spanish Bourbons and the family compacts is essentially that the French make sure that nobody comes through the Pyrenees and the Spanish don't leave the Pyrenees. Therefore, there's no reason for the French to go to Portugal, particularly. So nobody really has a great handle on what's there. And the I think that Napoleon will have been misled by Junot to some extent as well, because Junot's report did not tell him the state of the army of his army when it got to Lisbon at the very beginning, which was very bad, and he will just have reported that I marched successfully through the mountains, swept away all the militia, captured Lisbon, captured all the treasury. Oops, the king got away. Nevertheless, here's a country for you, Your Highness. So, based on that, I don't think Napoleon has any reason to think that, given he has, given that Soult has just chased the British out of Iberia and the Spanish are nowhere to be seen. They're there, but they're nowhere to be seen, so he doesn't care about them. He has no reason to believe that there's going to be any problem, and he has no true understanding of how difficult it is to get through those mountains. Even, Junot came in at a different angle. He didn't start at the top of the country either. Still has a lot farther to go. And there is still a British presence in Portugal as well. So not easy orders to successfully bring to fruition at all. And yeah, maps and information really play a big part in why that is a problem.
In a second, I'm going to open up Google Maps and just see, is it physically possible to walk from Oporto to Lisbon in the space of, what was it, Napoleon allowed? Something like 12 days.
Well, I mean, yeah, I
No,
guess,
sorry, 9 days.
yeah.
It might be technically possible to physically walk it using modern roads, but even then, I think it would be a tough ask. So we'll come back to you on
Yeah.
that in a second, folks. We will do research on the fly during this episode just for you. In terms of the Portuguese force, though, we don't want to ignore the fact that they are there and they are doing things. What have they got? Well, on paper, it's not particularly promising. Big numbers, but not necessarily quality. So 30,000 men in the north of Portugal, which sounds great. However, that's largely ordinanza, which is kind of militia. And some of that militia is like bands of university students who've clubbed together. And, they might have been shown, and this is the business end of a musket. I'm being slightly facetious there, but they have not been drilled in anything like the kind of way that suggests they are ready to take the field against the French army, which has just swept away most of what Spain had to offer.
Hmm.
So problems there. At the core of them, though, there are some regulars, about 5,000 regulars. The best troops, the troops in the best state out of those would be the 3,000 out of the Loyal Lusitanian Legion. Um, but from that 30k, you're effectively talking, what are the numbers there? So a sixth of that is in a decent state, and your core is a tenth of that force in terms of the Loyal Lusitanian Legion. These are not promising numbers, and yet impressively, um, they managed to just about make Saul have a little bit of a rethink, in the sense that when he first tries to push south into Portugal, the militia stop him. Now, he doesn't even start this operation until the 16th of February. I find that very telling because by that point, like, Napoleon's going, you should have been in Lisbon 4 days ago and you're just crossing the border. Gives you an indication of just how pie in the sky Napoleon's conceptualization of what's going to happen here actually is. But these local militia, they make him move around to Orennes, push across a bridge, and then march south. So it's not as though we have an inclination, don't we, to just kind of think, yeah, but militia. And that's not to imply that there isn't some significant truth in there. But you think about the Waterloo campaign, for example, how many times have we emphasized that Blucher's army is significantly made up of landwehr? We talk about how the Imperial Guard, the second wave of their assault at Waterloo, is defeated by predominantly a militia force just sent in with a bayonet charge. Sometimes the militia is called upon and they do a creditable job. And that's not to imply that they're on a par, but they're not the automatic walkover. It's not just kind of a given that these guys are a joke.
No, no, absolutely not. There are practical reasons why you want to have an army composed of regular infantry and cavalry and artillery, and that is simply because when battle commences in its regular form, you need troops to act like you expect them to, and you need them to perform under fire in chaos in a particular way. And militia can only do some of those things. Some of the time, they cannot do them all of the time. However, in a non-linear sense, militia are highly useful for this sort of operation. When Soult comes into Portugal, he doesn't really have a problem with defeating militia wherever he finds it, but they're everywhere. You said 30,000 men. That is roughly, that I think outnumbers him for a start. The majority of those are militia, and they are in the countryside. They're in the small towns that are difficult to get to. They're behind him. They're to his flanks. He needs to deal with them, and the time to deal with them is going to prove problematic. The fact that some of them, like you say, don't really know how to fire a musket, some of them don't have muskets, some of them have spears, is to do with the militia craze that some nations get. The United States had this problem, still has it actually, and probably, I'm sure some of your War of 1812 people will get to this, but they still have a militia problem. And you could see it in Spain as well with the rise of the partisans and the idea that the Central Junta has that, we can just defeat them with bands of partisans. No. This happens with Portugal as well. They've had a whole year-ish to themselves to try and figure out a plan, and they've come up with a militia plan. That's why you have 30,000 men wandering around in various militia bands, with only a handful of regular officers to sort of try and say, well, we really need to rebuild the army. Some might say, well, where is the regular army? You guys didn't get defeated, did you? Well, not technically. The problem is the French took most of the good officers for their Portuguese regiments, and the old Portuguese army is now somewhere between those 3,000 to 4,000 men who are still in Portugal, or they're in French under French command. So both sides have significant problems here, and I think Soult could probably have made a swift march to Lisbon if his troops were fighting fit, fresh, rested, but they are none of those things.
So just to throw some numbers into all of this, you're dead right. Saul's got about 16,000, give or take a bit, which again kind of taps into what you're saying in terms of, they're to the rear, they're to the sides, which begs that question of what do I detach to hold lines of communication?
He's not got very many cavalry either. That's a big problem.
That's another significant point. In terms of cavalry, he's looking at the 3rd Dragoon Division, the 4th Dragoon Division, just checking my notes here. And what else has he got? He's got bom, 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 bom. He's got Delon, Franceschi Delon. I've probably murdered the pronunciation there. So what we're talking about is about 3,000 cavalry. So not a significant, not a huge number. Particularly when your force size is not that big. So there are concerns there. Just doing a bit of admin, we said we'd give you an indication of how long it takes to walk from Oporto to Lisbon. Bearing in mind this is modern roads, folks, so paved, well drained. It takes you 72 hours. That's 72 hours on foot.
Mm-hmm.
That's not 72 hours with your sleeping. It's just 72 hours. Now you start to divide that up into days, and Napoleon's plan, you can easily do that in what was it, 9 days?
Something like that.
It suddenly seems 9 days. It suddenly seems utterly farcical. It works if it's a parade and if you push the guys quite hard. What he's fundamentally expecting is for Soult to do some kind of Juno, but maybe a little bit faster.
He's trying to get Soult to do something that he might have done in northern Italy, or Suvorov might have done, or something. One of these guys who can get a lot out of their men. If you can get to Lisbon in about 3 days on foot now,
but that's 72 hours of walking.
Yeah.
So it's not even 3 days. It's if you walked continuously for 72 hours, you would cover the distance.
You can just about stretch. Like his estimate is like the most optimistic possible time you can get a large amount of guys with equipment to that place, which, as we've said, given the state of the Soult's army and what Napoleon knows it's had to go through, is a very strange request. It's not something that I think Soult was a kind of a diplomatic guy when it came to Napoleon, but he was privately he tended to have a little bit more of a stronger opinion. I think he probably saw those orders and said, "Yeah, well, I'll get there when I get there, boss."
Wait your turn, hun. I'm busy right now. Leave me to cook. It's definitely not a phrase that Soult uttered ever in his entire life, but it gives you kind of an indication of how folks must have felt when they got some of these orders and then just looked at the distance and went, nah, not with
the other thing is that what would the state of the army be if you drove it that hard to get there in 9 days? Which I don't think is really possible. 10, 15 maybe, but at the fastest. But it would get there, and probably the Portuguese probably could have taken it out because there would be an utter wreck.
So he pushes south, and once he's able to get significant forces to bear, then you start to see what you would anticipate kind of playing out. So he pushes to Chavez. Again, apologies for the pronunciation there. It's probably more like Chavesh, on 9th March. And then from there, pushes onwards. He moves west at that point, and confronts a kind of militia with muskets, pikes, as you're saying, sort of agricultural implements, force under Baron Eben. So these are 25,000 men, but we've just caveated sort of the problems there.
That's nothing for
No.
the French are quite happy to deal with those numbers at this point, even if they're tired.
And that's at Povoado de Lanhosa. Um, so then you've got 20th of March at Battle of Braga, where they really take the Portuguese apart. The Portuguese lose about 4,000 killed, 400 captured. The French losses are estimated at about 40 dead, 160 wounded. They take 17 Portuguese cannons. It's all very one-sided at this stage, and that leaves the road open to Oporto or Porto, depending on quite how you want to phrase it. And here again, the situation doesn't look great. At this point, you've got about 4,500 Portuguese regulars. They're supported by 10,000 ordinanza, and you've got about 9,000 armed citizens. Well, the armed citizens, like, very heroic. However, against Napoleon's regulars, you can't expect huge amounts from them. It's a case of, backs to the wall, anybody who's able to pick up something and try and club someone over the head with it. We talked already.
Yeah. Well, the other thing we wanted to point out for people in terms of militia, which you don't really see until the partisan bands get going, really in Spain and in Portugal, is that if you're going to command them in battle, you can't be thinking like a regular officer. If you're talking about militia and volunteers and stuff like that, you can see examples in the American Revolution with the Battle of Cowpens. It's a very intuitive understanding of what these people can do. And it is laced into a bigger plan depending on a heavy punch from the regular infantry. So but nobody in the Napoleonic Wars really comes up with the understanding that we can use militia in battle, but we can only use them in a particular way, and we have to be we can't be talking to them either like we can our regulars, because they're volunteers and they're kind of forced to be here and all this sort of stuff. So there's just so many reasons why, although they could have been useful, they just don't stand a chance unearthly against a complete army of regular infantry and cavalry, and why the following happens.
Yeah, it's pretty one-sided. It's an assault from the north. That's the weak point in the city defenses. Folks looking at a map today will see this sort of sprawling metropolis that is Oporto, which is sort of absorbed into the southern bank as well. It's actually two cities, modern day Oporto. Southern part is Gaia, and the reason I know this is that I was in Oporto recently on business and had the opportunity to do some touring there. And there's a very kind of interesting way in which Gaia formulates, because the bishop of Oporto was trying to basically rake in tax revenue out of the wine, because that is, of course, port is Oporto's most famous export. And the merchants basically decided, well, look, we could dock on the bishop's side of the river and pay the taxes, or we could dock on the south side of the river and not pay the tax. Let's do that one. And thus the city of Gaia fundamentally born. But now, of course, they've expanded outwards into this much wider metropolis. They're not well linked by any stretch of the imagination, apart from a pontoon bridge, which I was reading had only been completed really quite recently, prior to the French assault.
Is there not an old bridge? Is there not a medieval bridge or anything like that?
That's what I'm struggling with in terms of.
I thought there was an old bridge.
There
but
must
maybe
have
it
been
was destroyed.
Something. It may well have been destroyed, and so this is a sort of a stopgap replacement. I'm struggling with that because, like you've got these two settlements, north and south. It doesn't make any sense for them to not be well connected, and yet there is only this pontoon bridge that folks can use, because as the French stream into the city, everybody wants to get the flaming hell out. They don't want to be in the way of these marauding French troops. quite understandable. Now, with hindsight, we know what that horror could actually look like. Think about what happens to Coimbra, etc. Now, they don't necessarily have that knowledge, but nonetheless, if you're a civilian and you hear that the French have stormed the city and they've broken through, the inclination to run away is probably quite strong and very, very understandable. That's a human nature thing. And so, as they all stream south, they all stream onto the waterfront. The banks of this riverside city are really quite steep, particularly in the confines of the old town. You've got to bear in mind that what you see on Google Maps today is a a vastly bigger metropolis than what existed at the time.
Mm.
And a lot of it is built on steep hills and almost cliffs in places, like borderline gorges. And so that there aren't many. Crossing isn't easy. It's fast flowing. You cannot swim across the darn thing.
Mm.
It's also quite a wide river because you're not far from the sea at all. You go 10, 15 minutes in a boat upstream and you're almost at the breakers coming in from the Atlantic. So there isn't space to really go anywhere. And there isn't much geography to play with, which therefore means that they all pile onto this pontoon bridge. And it's an absolute travesty and tragedy because it collapses under the weight. There are some suggestions that there've been deliberate sabotage in order to try and stop the French from being able to use it to keep pushing south. There are also suggestions about artillery fire, particularly from the Portuguese side, trying to hit French cavalry. Quite how much credence you can put onto all of those things is something you could debate endlessly and slightly pointlessly in terms of what may or may not have happened. The net result is literally thousands of people end up going in that river and being washed away. It's absolutely horrendous. And to this day, there are two memorials, one on each side of the river, at the point at which the pontoons were anchored. There is now a much bigger, almost kind of like suspension style bridge directly beside it that completely dwarfs it. Like these pontoon monuments are quite literally in the shadow of this bigger bridge, so it's clearly a optimal crossing point. But it is just a horrendous moment, a deeply sad moment. These people are washed away, all because they're trying to escape war. And I think it's always important to just kind of pause and reflect on that. They are washed up further downstream, and they're actually buried in one of the churches, but quite far upriver, which gives you an indication of just how far they get swept away.
Mm.
And it's a horrendous moment.
Yeah, it's one of the many tragedies of the Peninsular War. There are a lot of civilian there's a lot of civilian suffering in this war. Unlike anywhere else in Europe until the Russian campaign, practically, and probably surpasses the Russian campaign, I would think. The Partially the problem is that unlike in some other wars and in some smaller, in less densely populated areas, the people stay in Spain and Portugal. Prior to the advance of an army in most places in the Low Countries and places that, Belgium and Netherlands, things like that, some places, northern France, parts of Germany, parts of Italy, things like that, people run away. People flee in the advance of, large numbers of troops. And you do see mass evacuations, but they're forced evacuations during 1810 and 1811. But if the people are left to their own devices, they seem to run to the cities rather than as places of refuge, which is rather a medieval kind of concept, rather than fleeing the cities when those cities come under attack. And this sometimes lends itself to very, very significant civilian casualties. And this one is very tragic as well, because this is them trying to escape. Unfortunately, pontoon bridges in the Napoleonic Wars, they famously break. Do very dramatic effects, and the river as well is actually very fast. Like it's race when it gets going. If there's been rains, this is the early part of the year still, so you'd expect it to be quite high. It's going to be quite high. People may not be able to swim. It's very rocky shores. You do not have a great chance if you fall into that. And um, this is it's not a great moment for the for Soult's reputation either, because he will be blamed for a lot of civilian suffering.
It's not. In terms of what this means for Saul, sure, he's got to Porto, so that's stage one done. And where are we in terms of the timeline for this? I'm just trying to find the key date, 29th March. So we are talking more than 6 weeks behind Napoleon's schedule, which gives you an indication again of the reality of what he was facing. There's no indication that he was dragging his heels with any of this. And sure, he's captured the city, so phase one complete. But a couple of things are coming into play. One that we'll move on to talk about in just a second is the British. The British are back, baby.
Those rascals.
Yes, and we'll dwell on that whole thing. But the fact that it's taken longer has given the British time to pause, reflect, and come up with a new plan. But equally, the Portuguese aren't sitting idly by, because we've been talking about, these militia can still do things. They're just not necessarily your classic line of battle unit. And what they go and do is they promptly cut his lines of communication, to the point where we were talking about Chaves earlier. Well, the Portuguese lay siege to an 1,800-man garrison and force it to capitulate. So his line of retreat has been, at least for now, cut. His lines of communication are certainly cut. Things aren't looking great for Saul, even though he has achieved his primary objective. It's not as though he can just sit pretty in Oporto and sort of reflect on, okay, now what? Because now what has got a lot of headaches for him, and he's probably, at least initially, got a bigger eye on the situation behind him than he has on the situation in front of him.
The I believe he's going to need to, he must call Ney down to assist him, and that will clear his line of communication. But as we mentioned in an earlier episode when we were talking about the basic situation at the after Corunna, generally speaking, the French, it's just another classic thing of the French just sort of winning, but then getting no victory out of it, because now Napoleon's gone back to Europe and all the marshals are messing around in Spain and Portugal. And although they're winning battles, they're little islands of success and nothing meaningful is coming out of them. This is happening in Spain as well. Soult could logically have relied on Victor, I believe. Victor being, I think, in Estremadura at the second, opposed to, he's chasing De Cuesta around. And I believe, I think that Victor has some sort of order to support Soult, but he can't, because the Spanish are still there. And, there's a bunch of mountains in the way. There are fortresses in the way. He can't get in. So Soult is cut off from both sides by the Portuguese. He is actually effectively surrounded. He can push on to Lisbon, but that will require possibly a siege because they know he's coming. And, the bridge that I could have used to move forwards is not there anymore. So, but on the other hand, I have supplies in Porto and things like that. And, I'll clear the lines of communications eventually. So he's not in danger, but he's not achieving a meaningful success, and that is the big problem with the French in Iberia, really.
It's a problem that's going to dog them the whole way through, isn't it? Let's turn our attention to the British at this point in time, because they're back, sort of. Huzzah,
Who saw that coming?
maybe. But this is the interesting thing, right? Who saw that coming? But there's a shift in momentum and there's a shift in interest that we've emphasized before, in the sense that we've talked about how Moore's force is going to go on to become fundamentally the force that goes to Walcheren, which therefore begs the question, where does this campaign now sit in Britain's list of strategic priorities? And that's not an easy question for the British to answer at the time. There's a lot of kind of deliberation about, well, what do we do now? Because we sent a big force and it got sent packing. This is not a good situation. And so I think it's fair to say that um, the Peninsular War drops in terms of Britain's list of strategic priorities at this point in time. Um, there is debate actually about whether more can be achieved by sending a force to southern Spain, to the point where they try and dispatch about 4,000 troops. But there's a condition attached to this, which is, look, you've got to let us in through Cadiz. And the Spanish turn around and go, let me just raise this little place that you may have heard of. It's called Gibraltar. And what you see is kind of a demonstration of the fragility of this association. And it's more of an association than anything else, in the sense that it's very much my enemy's enemy is my friend for Britain and Spain during this period. We emphasize this right at the start. The problem hasn't gone away, and there is distrust. And the Spanish are genuinely concerned that if they let the British into Cadiz and give them the freedom of the city, Cadiz is going to become Gibraltar 2.0, and they're not prepared to allow that. So you instantly see not only that the British aren't thinking about Portugal necessarily as the place where we can make significant things happen. They're thinking about the south of Spain, but also that relationship with the Spanish and the way that it's very fractious is not something that's unique to Wellington. And it's not something that Wellington is the first to encounter. This is going to be a running theme, and has been a running theme throughout this conflict already.
Absolutely. The Spanish have good reason to suspect that the British might want something in return for the effort. And another port city would just be fun, wouldn't it? I mean, the history tells them that in quotes, English as they were, came and attacked Cadiz multiple times through history, just to reinforce the idea that Britain and Spain are not natural allies. They have not been natural allies for a very long time. As only 4 years before, many Spanish families were deprived of their loved ones by a certain chap by the name of Admiral Nelson, and the same goes back to on the British side. You know, going back to the consequence of navies here. If the Spanish still had a navy, they might not have needed the British, and there could have been a very big problem here. But yeah, planners in Whitehall, they look at maps too, and they see that, well, still got a toehold in Lisbon. We've got a few thousand men still there, and we've got Gibraltar. So we tried Lisbon before. Maybe we should try southern Spain, because the Spanish still control that, and maybe we should, do that. It's logical. It seems logical. But I think it is that sort of that sort of mistrust of the Spanish at the same time that sort of saps confidence in that plan, and they'd like to try and do a little bit of both. I don't think it's as high as a priority as it was, hence they switched their focus back to the Low Countries, which has always been the traditional strategic focus for the British. The Baltic and the Low Countries is the thing they need to protect, all those juicy ports and things like that. But the government does still feel a responsibility and a opportunity in Iberia. And that is why it is not just because Wellesley writes one of his famous memorandums about defending Portugal that they decide they send him back. They just see that he's still interested in it. The government at that point is just about able to say, now there's a matter of vengeance involved, and we need to go back and make sure we establish ourselves as you know, doing our best and have done our best, and therefore it is allowable to send a arguably weaker, lesser force back to Portugal.
I think the fact that they send Wellesley is significant as well. We have this conversation so much in the early phase of the Peninsular War about Wellesley sort of getting lucky. He's the junior guy who's kind of sent out to cover whilst more senior guys are on their way to actually do the quote unquote proper waging of the war. The fact that they've gone back to, hey, let's take that junior guy and let's send him out. He's making a lot of noise about how he can make this happen. Well, sure, let's give him a go. Let's see what he's got. That feels to me very much the emphasis of what's going on there in terms of actually some stuff might happen, but we've got bigger things. Like, we're not going to stop this, but that's a case of let's make the Peninsula War an iron in the fire as opposed to our primary focus.
I do think as well that there was a strategic necessity to make sure that the French did not take Lisbon at the very least. That as a priority, I don't think the government expected long-term deployments realistically. I don't think they expected to win the war here after Corunna. I think they wanted just to deprive Portugal to the French, and Wellesley said he could do it. Now, they weren't blind. Sintra had been a problem, but they did see the results. Wellesley's face was plastered onto porcelain across the country and in newspapers and stuff like this because he won those battles. And they're not going to ignore that in the sense that he was one of the few now living junior generals, young generals who seem to have some energy about them. And so he is the perfect guy to send. He's practically the only guy to send. And it is important that the French don't get Lisbon.
And in terms of the force that he's got with him, these aren't big numbers. 16,000 on the rolls, close to 17,000 in April. That's going to rise to 24,000. But when you're talking about effectives, I'm using Andrew Bamford's monthly returns here. In April, he's got just shy of 14,000 men to play with. In May, that number's 20,500 men. So these aren't huge numbers. It's not a vast force. And that's going to have implications in terms of going on the offensive. You often hear folks talk about within the army talk about ratios of something like 2 or even 3 to 1 when you're attacking a position. Well, when you don't have big numbers at your disposal, that's going to make this tricky. And so it raises some interesting questions about what Wellesley does next, because he doesn't hang around. And I'm very curious about this. In the sense that there's a phase in Wellesley's career, the early phase in his career, where there's a lot of either outright aggression or considered aggression. And I think you and I could probably debate this a little bit in terms of whether or not a sigh is just outright aggression, and what you see during the Peninsula is something close. It's kind of a midpoint between that outright aggression and considered aggression. Versus what you see later in his career, vis-a-vis particularly 1810, 11, 12, where there is an aggressive streak in him, but it is much more considered, and it's much more about when is the right time to make that aggressive move. That's something that particularly bleeds through the Salamanca campaign, for example. And I'm not seeing that yet in what we see with Wellesley. And I wonder if there's always this knee-jerk reaction, right? So it's Wellesley / Wellington. Let's praise him, and there's almost this sort of assumption of ability that is equal all the way through his career, as if he's sort of born the guy who will go and win at Salamanca, at Vittoria, etc. And I think when you actually start to dissect these battles in much more detail, as we are doing here, and start to just kind of reflect on what some of his motivations might be, you see a tempering of Wellesley. over the course of his career, in the sense that I get the feeling he knows he needs to achieve some results and he needs to do that pretty quickly. And that's part of the reason he doesn't hang around. He's kind of put his reputation out there as, you send me back, I can make some things happen. So they send him back. So now he's got to deliver. And he's the sort of person who will absolutely do his damnedest to deliver. That's the nature of the guy. But that does mean being much more aggressive than perhaps other generals might have been inclined to do. What's your read of this?
The Wellesley of 1808, 1809 is still the Wellesley of India. He's still got that mindset in his head for very good reasons, that India represents his, as of only the last summer, his main experience of soldiering, his main experience of victory. And he's probably doing that thing that a lot of successful people do as they move through their careers. They begin by having a success, and then they will try and start to create a sort of formula based on that success because they think that worked. So I'll rinse and repeat that. When he comes up against the French, he attacks them just outright. He does it at Roliça, and strategically he does it at Vimeiro, although he allows them to attack him because he learns some things at Roliça. The attacking instinct is still there, however, because there's no reason for it to go away yet. He's still not tested enough against the French to know how to do anything else. He doesn't have a mode of operation, a mode of operandum to defeat them properly yet. He doesn't know what works every time. He knows what works in India. He knows the principles of supply, and from good supplies you can act with great freedom and aggression, if you so will. And that is what he brings to the difficult terrain of Portugal, which I feel like he went through some mountains in India, mountainous areas in India as well. I think that Spain and Portugal kind of resonated with him in terms of its remoteness, so he was not challenged by it. And he was not challenged. He wasn't afraid of the French. He famously said just before he left that they may defeat me, but they won't frighten me first. So he wants to fight them at this point, and he wants to drive them and push them and see how they react. And it is, as you say, the more he fights the French, the more comfortable he gets in front of the French, the more he adapts his style to fight them. By 1810, 1811, he realizes that if I can instigate a battle where I do not have to attack, they will attack me because that's the only thing they know how to do. So I can get them to fight, and then they will attack me, and I can drive them off. But that hasn't happened yet. At this point, he is going to go and seek a battle, partially because of that logistical thing that I just mentioned, some logistical truths of what is going to happen. When he lands in Lisbon, he has everything he needs right there. He has a springboard. He has his own troops from Britain. He has troops that were left in Portugal. I think that it's close, like in total, it's close to 24,000 men when united all together. And so this is an attacking force. He knows he can attack Soult. And I don't know if Wellesley knows this, but Soult has no clue that there is that many British troops just sitting in Lisbon. So I think that we shouldn't be looking at Wellesley at this point in the kind of his great command over every situation. I think we should be looking at him as a much more flexible, opportunistic general who is still very much running off an old playbook.
Yeah, there is definitely a sense for me of a guy in a hurry who's looking to make his name. And that's not necessarily to imply that he's reckless. I
No?
would question whether or not Asai is the closest he gets to recklessness, but save that for when we sit down and discuss Asai. But there's a I'm going to go and get these guys. I'm going to show people what I can do. You see it at Relitha. Vimiro's a battle that's pushed on him by necessity, but he's no shrinking violet. He wants to go get them in the aftermath of Vimiro, and I think you see it again here. We should say that Wellesley isn't the only inverted commas big boy in the playground at this point in time. Beresford has already been sent out prior to Wellesley, and he is being tasked with the reorganization of the Portuguese army. An interesting kind of slow burn that's going to be quite key. It could have ended up being quite fractious in the sense that Beresford is already trying to poach some of Wellesley's good officers, or what are now Wellesley's officers, in the sense that they're going to retrain the Portuguese army if they can buy the time, in the British mode and in the British system. Now that's something that's going to take months of training and drill and all the rest of it to come to fruition. But nonetheless, there is a plan there. These aren't guys that at this moment in time you can immediately deploy into the front line and trust them. We're going to, discuss that further vis-a-vis Basarco when we get there the following year. But nonetheless, there's a crystallization of a plan. And what does surprise me about this is the long-term vision that's being shown here, that the British are thinking, yeah, we could actually retrain this force. And it puzzles me slightly because the mood music isn't for long-term investment in the Iberian Peninsula. And there are going to be huge debates over the next 12 to 24 months about, are we just wasting our time? And yet, right at this very critical moment, a very positive and very expensive decision is made that, yeah, we're just going to basically re-raise the Portuguese army and we're going to train it in our style. It's going to be a kind of proto-quasi-British army under fundamentally a British commander. And I find that very odd and surprising in terms of a decision that will be so crucial, that is, the right decision is taken at exactly the right time.
Mm-hmm. But it's like a little what I was saying before. People get this impression that the British government was a little bit gun shy whenever something went wrong. Um, whenever if there's a loss, they immediately pull out and they run back to Britain and they try somewhere completely different, like Buenos Aires or something like that. It's that kind of opinion. It's not really the case at all. It's much more considered than that. And with the case of Portugal, although nobody had a real handle on what was going on in Spain, because Spain is a very dodgy geographical expression to try and understand, as the French found out. But Portugal's much more simple. There are two major rivers, several major valleys. It's quite difficult to get, it's like to actually conquer from the outside, but to reconquer from the inside is relatively straightforward, as Wellesley pointed out in his memorandum. So, based on certain considerations, for a start, Lisbon, port. We like ports. We would like to keep this port. Portugal, outright, no qualms about it. They are friendlier to us than the Spanish and they hate the French. This, therefore, is good ground to continue the fight against Napoleon indirectly, even if we cannot maintain ourselves there for a long time. If we can hold on to the place long enough that we can give it an army to defend itself, then that is enough. That will distract the French. That will be a pain to the French. A lot of this is damage control, to show, I feel, that that Britain is active in coalition building. For a start, there is a massive. The Austrians are currently spoiling for a fight in Central Europe, but there's not much coalition building going on. The British need to show that they are still in the game, and they need to find places they can do that. Portugal is one of them. It's, the Iberian Peninsula is in the press. It is the place where Napoleon and, the Grand Army tripped. Everybody still remembers this. So the British government absolutely has looked at this with objectivity, and they have not just looked at the disaster of Corunna, they have looked at a practical solution to a bad outcome, and they found an officer who was willing to carry that a new plan through there.
Absolutely. It's worth saying that Wellesley backs the Beresford vision,
Oh yes.
um, very much so. And that helps. And I think it helps partly in terms of building that relationship. It demonstrates the trust and the faith, and that there isn't going to be this sort of challenge between the two of them. Um, but also, it obviously helps.
I think it is made quite clear that Wellesley carries seniority, even though Beresford technically outranks him.
Yeah,
But
it's a delicate game to play, but it's a problem in the British Army,
oh yeah.
right? There are officers who cannot, will not, depending on their individual takes, serve because they're not going to serve under somebody who is more junior than them.
Hmm.
Um, and that creates issues in terms of the quote unquote talent that can and can't be sent out. It's not necessarily at that moment in time that Wellesley is the best man for the job or the only man for the job in the British Army. It's that they actually can't send certain people out because
Hmm.
he's not senior enough to be able to stay in command. And while he's winning, well, let's keep our best guy
Hmm.
in the fight because clearly he knows the terrain and the situation.
Moore is dead. The guys we originally sent out to replace him, we have basically softly dismissed from the service, and so there is not really a great amount of options especially since he did a really smooth career move of coming up with that memorandum to show that he had a plan. No other general under consideration for this operation had that, and he had friend, and most importantly, we must admit as well, Wellesley had friends in the
Of course
government
he did. Yeah.
who were
Rory Muir
fighting.
enters the chat
Yeah.
at this point, right? Go read that 2-volume biography, which very emphatically demonstrates that Wellesley is a political animal every step of the way. And that, it's not a case that there are two phases to his life, his political and his military. Actually, the two are deeply intertwined. That's why he is so effective. Yeah, he has friends in significant places, and that absolutely helps. Can you imagine, though, if they'd sent Baird out? Because they do not get on well. But that's a
That'd be
story for another
hilarious.
day. Um,
That's old India ghosts coming back to haunt him if that was the case.
oh boy, wouldn't it just be the case? So Wellesley goes on the offensive. We've alluded to it for the past half an hour, quite frankly. And it's when you look at his deployment and kind of what he's sending where, I think it's very interesting that he's immediately looking at a macro outflanking as opposed to just the micro outflanking that we see at Oporto. And what I mean by that is that he's sending off Portuguese contingents towards Lamego under Silveira. Silveira. Apologies to our Portuguese listeners.
My pronunciation is going to be much more Castilian than Portuguese, so
that would cause just as much offense. Like,
exactly,
because
Castilians would say it's Silvera or something like that.
okay. But what that means is if you look at a map, that's effectively directly east of Porto by a good 40 odd miles. So he's already thinking about the macro outflank as well as the micro outflank that he will then conduct
in
Porto.
in his mind. He has already defeated the French and is already sending out flanking forces.
I mean, it's quite Wellingtonian in its stance,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And whilst he's doing that, he pushes north quite obviously in the direction of Porto. Little bit of pushing back of Mametta and Franceschi. They see the British coming and like, okay, we're not going to fight this one particularly hard, which I suspect is an indication that Saul's got eyes on the situation behind him as well as in front of him. And hey, there's this lovely, deep, fast-flowing river that can protect my southern flank. I'm quite content for Wellesley to sit on the other side of the river, and I'll just thumb my nose at him. It's sure the precautions are taken. Some boats are pulled back onto the northern bank because you don't want to give the guys an opportunity to just casually cross the river under your nose. But once you've done that, from Saul's perspective, he thinks he's sitting moderately pretty. I'm not suggesting complacency, but you can kind of see why in 1809 he's not overly concerned. If he thinks he's got all the boats, or at least all the significant boats, we're not talking like a rowing boat where you can fit two people in. If he thinks
You
he's got
think you're so great.
well, it's the French who think they're so great because they've got boats on this occasion. That that little skit comes back to haunt this podcast yet again. So Saul thinks he's so great because he's got boats.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
There you go. And I'm going to play that just because you can imagine a world in which Napoleon would look at this situation and chastise Saul.
You thought you were so great because you had all the boats.
It's beautiful. The world comes full circle somehow. So Wellesley rocks up, technical term, obviously, and looks at this situation. And the geography is significant here. And I just want to emphasize it again. High cliffs for a big chunk of the area from the heart of Gaia, that second city, sort of on the southern bank, all the way east until fundamentally directly opposite that bishop's seminary. And it was only going there that this really struck me, because I hired a boat, and I thought it was so great because I had a boat. And so I hired this boat and went upriver. And as you can imagine, just looked at it purely from a tactical terrain perspective. And the thing that immediately strikes you about this is that the crossing point is the point at which the cliffs stop. And the ground very rapidly just drops down to river level. Fundamentally, it is the nearest embarkation point to Gaia / Oporto. So sure, you can make an argument, Wellesley picks the critical point and he identifies a seminary. Well, yes, but part of what is clearly feeding that decision is the logistics. And I'm not saying that he doesn't identify the seminary and kind of think, okay, take the high ground. That's going to be imposing. It overlooks the slightly lower sections of Oporto, bearing in mind, much smaller city and all of that. I'm not saying there isn't forethought in play, because there absolutely is. But the geography works perfectly for the plan.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that you can argue both ways. One is that, well, he fundamentally comes up with this plan because the landscape allows it, and he can't do anything else unless he moves even further to the east. But I mean, he's not going to go west, because if you keep going west, well, then you end up in the sea. And your army is, if you end up unable to support, then your army is basically trapped between a hostile force, the sea, and the river. So they're in a cul-de-sac fundamentally, and that's not good. So he's only got one option. So I'm not so inclined to buy into the Wellingtonian genius of this plan, but rather a practical assessment of the terrain. And, well, if you're going to make this happen, that's the spot. And it's not to imply that the seminary is a weak spot, but in terms of getting your men across, which is really what matters with this amphibious assault, that's the place where you've got to do it.
Mm-hmm. It is an interesting sort of thing to think about, really. It ties into, for me, back to Wellesley and India mode, to be honest. And again, we'll get to the difference between audacity and aggression and various things when we eventually talk about Asai and his operations like there. But one of the things that strikes me about Porto and Wellesley is that, first of all, he is very good at reading ground. So that is to be remembered. When he comes in front of Porto, he's never seen it before in his life. But obviously, I think you're right in saying that the majority of people would obviously be able to look at that bank and say, well, if I'm going to cross here, it has to be there. Now, the thing that separates Wellesley from other commanders is the fact that he even considers it for more than 5 minutes, because the French control that bank. And what are the chances of getting troops across there without getting shot to pieces? Most generals with this understanding would probably see the same opportunity because it's fairly obvious. We must all take your word for it because I've not been to Porto, but I trust you. And they would probably maneuver to find a different way or withdraw and hope the French cross and attack them when they've crossed. But Wellesley looks at that, says, "Well, that is the logical point, and I'm not an illogical person. Is there a way I can get across?" And so that's when you get the whole thing playing out, where he searches for boats. And that's where the plan comes to fruition. So I think that is a moment of opportunity. This is made up on essentially as he goes, as he arrives and looks at the situation. He doesn't want to maneuver. He wants to attack. So if you give Wellesley in India mode a crack, he will exploit it.
And there you have it. It's important to say he's, again, thinking not quite macro, but he's sort of thinking whatever the mid-range is between micro and macro, because he does send that another flanking force fundamentally. Murray, just shy of 3,000 men, the entire brigade with the 14th Light Dragoons is sent to Avintesh to cross the river there. But that's 5 miles away. And I think you make an interesting point here that actually another commander would perhaps have gone, okay, I'm going to send more men to Avintesh. We're going to advance up that side of the river and then see what we can do. And he doesn't do that. He doesn't wait. The move to Avintesh is we're cutting his line of retreat. So you're going to march 5 miles in that direction. You're going to head north. You're going to cut the road. And then he's going to be hemmed in. Meanwhile, I'm going to push this force across. Part of me wonders if it's a diversionary attack in terms of how it's conceptualized, because, hey, look, I'm going to keep these guys busy with this assault across the river that's fundamentally frontal. Sure, it does exploit a flank, but it's in such close proximity. You know, the distance is perhaps a 20-minute walk.
It's nothing. The French control that bank. It's
not. It's not a big distance by any stretch of the imagination. And so by pushing these guys across, it creates the distraction that therefore means if somebody sort of turns around and goes, oh, you know, we've got British troops on the North Bank. So it's going to be like, yeah, people, like, I got this. Like the seminary, I'm all aware. No, Avintesh, like, what, you're telling me I've got to worry about somewhere 5 miles away? Sure, maybe, but right now they're on my front door. You know, I wonder if that's what's at play. Not being in Wellesley's mind, I can't know that.
It could be. It could be. If you look at Roriza, then you know that he's not averse to fixing someone's attention and trying to do something clever. That was very elaborate, that plan at Roriza, but it shows what he was capable of thinking up. This is, I think that this is an interesting thing to observe, because good generals will make actions that enhance their possibilities at every turn. That is what makes a good general. That force could be an outflanking force. It could be a distraction, or it could be the thing that cuts Soult's retreat. It actually is all three. He has observed that to increase my chances of victory, I can spare 4,000 men to go down to that other crossing point and go and then do what they think is best from the options that are available to them. It just increases his odds of having a successful outcome realistically. The fact it's only 4,000 men suggests that he wasn't really pinning a lot of hopes on it, because Soult could have swung down with a considerable amount of troops and hammered that if he so wished, if he was on the ball. But Soult doesn't think there's a possible way he can cross the river without him knowing about it within the hour. And that's, from the French perspective, where things go terribly, terribly wrong. Because obviously there is nobody watching the river.
It's a bizarre thing, isn't it? You know, these guys are in 3 wine barges. These are moderate-sized vessels. They're not big. You could probably fit 30 people in at a push. If you really crammed them in, maybe I'm a bit
I think it is like a matter of
overzealous.
three companies or something like that go over first,
Yeah,
something like
we're
that.
we're not talking big numbers here. And you know, it's the buffs are sent across first. There's a lot of debate about quite who goes over, but the consensus is the buffs go across first. And um, that they take this seminary and then hold it, and the reinforcements come across. And what's quite striking is that there comes a point where Soult has to pull men away from the riverfront, and at that point, then the third crossing opportunity opens up because the civilians take one look at this and go, "Well, you're not guarding the boats anymore." The Portuguese think they're so great because they have boats.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
And so they take these boats across the river to Gaia to this wharf, which is
They pull
an
a Jack
embarkation and
Sparrow.
disembarkation point because they haul all of the wine out of the river, out these riverboats into Gaia. And so it opens up the floodgates. And so therefore it opens up that additional front. And the French have to cut and run.
Yeah. So it's a very embarrassing, sudden, panicked flight, basically. And it is necessary because um, having been defeated at all points and having no resource left to contest the crossing, the British are now fully entrenched in the city, and then not being shifted off that bank. Soult is not prepared, as is famously evidenced by the fact he was having breakfast or something at the time. And the British officers had an impromptu, rather delightful meal at his expense, which everybody thought was very funny. There's no other option but to get the heck out of there as quickly as possible before you do get trapped somewhere. On the riverbank or something like that. But the problem then that Soult faces is, can I get out of Portugal alive? Because now the British are indeed coming, and there's a lot of them.
Yeah, they're coming from the south, but also the macro and the sort of moderate, I haven't got the intermediate outflanking maneuvers now come into play, right? Because suddenly you've got these forces well positioned to just cut the if Soult is going to make a cut and run for Spain, he either heads north or he does the equivalent of a diagonal hypotenuse across the face of this allied army to try and get to the Spanish border. Now that means he's got a further distance to travel unless he drops everything and heads north. And the reason that you wouldn't be inclined to drop everything and head north is those Galician mountains that we talked about before. That's not an easy route to traverse. And the net result is that in the end, they have to drop everything. All 58 of their guns have to be abandoned. And it's not so much the battle where they lose the significant casualties, about 600 casualties, killed and wounded, compared to about 125 British. So sure, the British win the battle numerically, strategically, every which way, but it's with the retreat that the disaster really sets in, because he has no choice but to push towards Orense in Spain. And over the course of that retreat, somewhere in the region of 4,500 men are lost. The military chest is lost. The baggage is lost. It's a kind of Byron in reverse in some respect, or it's the other way that you could play a. No, it's not the other way you could play a Byron. Let's be real, but it's that situation of I can surrender everything, or we can try and fight it out, and I'm going to lose a shed load of men in the process, but we get away. And rather than surrender, he chooses to walk it out, but at huge loss and huge cost. I'm not sure if I'd quite call it a Corunna, a French Corunna, but it's not a million miles away in terms of the suffering and the horrendous blow it is as well, psychologically and in terms of reputation.
It's a very swift reversal of fortunes. This lends itself to the legend of Wellington to some extent. At the time, it seemed like, just like poetry, we have our revenge on Soult, who killed Moore and chased our boys out. We've now done exactly the same thing to him. There's poetry in that. The British press like that a lot. Um, and of course, strategically and meaningfully, yeah, it is a startlingly successful operation from Wellesley's point of view. The only downside is that, as usual has happened in 1808 and would happen for the rest of his career in Spain and Portugal, he cannot quite get his hooks into the retreating force to completely destroy it. You are looking at again an opportunity here that he almost had at Vimiero to completely destroy or capture a French force. It's probably the last time he's as close to being able to do this, because I'm not sure if anybody's really persuaded that anybody could have actually cut the retreat at Salamanca. Maybe it's actually as far away as Victoria that he gets another opportunity of this scale. And to bag a marshal as well would have been amazing if they could have captured Soult. But Soult is a capable guy. He understands very brutally what has happened, appraises it very coldly, correctly understands that the shortest way out is the best, and to get out the shortest way out, I need to throw away everything. And he does. And he gets out, because there's no way in hell Soult is going to pull a Dupont. Nobody is pulling a Dupont again. Everybody is going to fight to the death. Now, Napoleon has ordered it.
Yeah, there isn't going to be another Byron, because somebody will lose a head if there's another Byron.
Yeah.
It's that simple. Yeah, I think it's also an absolute boon for Wellesley's reputation. I said I could come out here and
just like that.
And I
just
click
land.
my fingers. He's been back in the country like 6 weeks or something,
Yeah.
and he's kicked them out. He hasn't done it in what was it, 10 days, like Napoleon thought it could be done. But it's still an impressive achievement, and crucially, it buys Wellesley time, right? Which is always going to be
a flex. It's a bit of a flex of my abilities here. What I can do.
You can just imagine him sort of standing there doing a Murat-esque buttock clench. No, you can't imagine Wellesley doing a Murat-esque buttock clench at any point.
Just a rather cold, just a self-satisfied smile, just a little,
with a gentle nod. So it does fundamentally, joking aside, buy him time, because it proves the point. Look, I keep coming out here and I keep getting successes in record quick time. So trust me and listen to me, and you will see that in what happens. And we'll dwell on this a little bit more when we do the Talavera episode with an eye on the time. But there are some big and very ranty letters that are coming the way of the British government about the nature of the British army, about scope of what can be done in Portugal. Wellesley achieves the success at Oporto and then starts thinking macro but long term. He's not just dealing with okay, great, I've dealt with the French here, now on to Spain. It's that kind of mentality of we've got things that we need to deal with very fundamentally. And he's not afraid to, having sent memoranda, which he's done all the way through his career, let's be real, when he was writing to his brother, he wasn't shy in saying we need to do this, that, and the other. That mentality will continue. But of course, it's bolstered now because, hey, I wrote you this memorandum, you sent me out, and I achieved the success. So you're going to listen to me, aren't you? What do you mean you want to discuss this concept?
I keep winning. I just keep winning. This is my third try here, and I just keep winning. So give me the means. Give me the means. And yeah, he is definitely thinking long term. He's doing that thing where he's again using his experience from his early days of command, his obsessive attention to detail in terms of building up a safe place from which he can operate. That's what he sees Portugal as right now. As of this point, he has every option available to him practically. The French are in retreat. Portugal requires some more conquering to some extent up in the north, but nevertheless, it's also, I suppose, more resecuring would be the word. But he has these options now, and he's very tempted to use them. He may well be thinking about the Portuguese army and, getting his expeditionary force into a better shape and getting more men and things like that. But it's May. It's still early May. There's a lot of campaigning season left, and he's got a French army on the run. Spain is looking very tempting to a Wellesley in India mode as well, is all we should say.
That is a little teaser for folks to look forward to when we do sit down and talk about a little place called Talavera, where I suspect the first indications of the defensive general myth will be truly laid in terms of the foundation of that myth. If folks are interested in reading a little bit more, we recommend David Buttery's Wellington Against Soult, the Second Invasion of Portugal, 1809, available from Pen and Sword. As I always say, folks, go direct. Although, what I would say is that at one point this was going on Naval and Military Press. So if you are one of those who doesn't have the financial means, you can get a nicely written book with some decent and very useful maps in there. Also a very nice chronology at the start. Decent kind of piece of work all round on this campaign. So do go and avail yourself. But importantly, also, whilst you're in shopping mode, why not treat yourself to Bullock's Grain and Good Madeira on the Maratha and Jat campaigns, or Every Hazard and Fatigue if you're one of these people who likes lace and 18th century stuff, because apparently such people do exist. Josh, it's always a joy to see you. Thank you so much for your time. This has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access to all episodes, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-July 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Peter Finley, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, Wojciech Stefanovic, Zach Johnson, and Simon Weathers. The Admirals: Ian Harding, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, Darla Vincent, and Rob Painter. The Chiefs of Staff: David Maxwell and Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars: Kate Walcombe, Clemens Bevan, Dan Hazelwood, and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well. And as always, thank you for listening.